Let's quickly compare the somatic and autonomic efferent pathway. In an efferent pathway, messages or impulses are being carried away from the spinal cord to the effectors. Okay, and that's why we call it the efferent pathway. Now, the first one over here is the somatic pathway. Now, the word somatic means soma. Soma means the body. So, somatic motor division is involved in transmitting signals towards somatic effectors like the skeletal muscles and the joints and the skin. And the somatic nerve fibers originate at a conscious level in the brain, basically the cerebral cortex, where the cerebral cortex sends a message down the spinal cord directly to the effector. So there's a single neuron carrying the message from the spinal cord via the efferent pathway all the way to the effector, which is the skeletal muscle right here. Now, the efferent neurons in the somatic motor division are highly myelinated. This high level of myelination allows really quick nerve conduction, okay? Because from the moment you think that you want to walk, get up and walk, you just do it, right? So you can imagine how quick the nerve conduction is, and that's why these neurons, axons, are highly myelinated. Now, the somatic divisions are specific in the sense they know exactly where they're going, and they're highly specific and localized to that particular region or effector. Okay, for example, right over here you see the neuromuscular junction, so they know exactly where they're going and they're very specific. And another thing to note over here is that it is a single neuron system and there is no intermediate synapse between the central nervous system and the target organ. All right, so let's quickly write it down. The somatic motor division or the somatic efferent division is involved in voluntary activities, and that includes skeletal muscles. They originate at the central nervous system, the conscious level. Okay, so the cerebral cortex basically tells our muscles to get up and get going so we can walk around the room. And then one of the major things that you need to remember is that it is a one neuron system. And no intermediate synapse is present between the neurons. Okay, it directly ends at the effector, and they are highly myelinated throughout. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the autonomic efferent pathway. Like I said, efferent means, carrying signals away from the spinal cord and central nervous system towards the effector. Okay, so the autonomic efferent pathway can be divided into the sympathetic motor division and the parasympathetic motor division. The sympathetic motor division and the parasympathetic division are only involved in the efferent pathway. So when we talk about autonomic pathways, we're talking about efferent pathways only. All of these structures do contain afferent neuron. It is not categorized as a parasympathetic or a sympathetic afferent neuron. When we talk of sympathetic and parasympathetic motor innervation, we are only talking about the efferent pathways. And these pathways in nervous tissue are involved in involuntary activities like the cardiac muscles. They innervate the smooth muscle fibers, they innervate the fat cells, different glands of the body, everything that we have no conscious control over. Sorry about that. So anything in the body over which we have no conscious control is controlled or innervated by the autonomic nervous system, and the signals originate in the hypothalamus. So they originate in the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. So these structures activate the target neuron that are present in the peripheral nervous system. So the hypothalamus itself is considered the master controller of the body. And you can see that the sympathetic and parasympathetic motor division are a two neuron system. Okay, so there are two neuron systems because you see one preganglionic fiber and another postganglionic fiber. So we have looked at the term of what ganglion is, right? Ganglion. Now ganglion are structures like this over here where cell bodies are concentrated. So you find bundles of cell bodies over here. This is a cell body. So these cell bodies synapse with the axon terminal of another neuron in the ganglions. Okay, so the ganglions in the autonomic nervous system are present either right by the spinal cord, like in case of the sympathetic division, or these ganglions are present very close to the effector or the target organ itself. So we'll look at that a little later. We can see, just keep in mind, you're seeing this a ganglion, and this over here is the ganglion. So there are two types of ganglions. You have the preganglionic fiber, and then you have the postganglionic fiber. The first fiber from the central nervous system to the ganglion is called the preganglionic fiber, and the second neuron from the ganglion to the effector is called the postganglionic fiber. So the autonomic nervous system involves a two neuron pathway wherein the efferent neurons synapse with each other either somewhere in between or closer to the target organ itself, like in the parasympathetic. Okay, you can see over here the two neurons synapse somewhere in between the pathway and the parasympathetic motor division. Can either synapse very close to the organ or inside the tissue of the organ itself. And there's another thing that you observe over here, that the preganglionic fiber is myelinated, whereas the postganglionic fiber is unmyelinated. Okay, so you will need to remember these terms as we move on. So if you haven't understood what a ganglion is, you might want to stop and understand the meaning of a ganglion. A ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies. So in a ganglion, usually you see a whole bunch of cell bodies, and then you're going to see synapses. So this, let's just say this is a nerve. Okay, not a pretty drawing. And this is a ganglion, that's a bulge. So this axon terminal will synapse with another nerve in the ganglion. Okay, and the dendrites are the receiving ends of the neuron, whereas the axon are the ends of the nerve that carry the impulse away from the neuron. Okay, so dendrites are the receiving ends. All right, the other terms you want to be familiar with is preganglionic cells, preganglionic neurons, synapse on the dendrites and cell bodies of the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so this becomes the preganglionic, and this one over here becomes the postganglionic cell. So I'm going to erase this and write it in black so you don't get confused. So that is the preganglionic cell, and this one is the postganglionic cell. Okay, so postganglionic cell bodies in the autonomic ganglia are located peripherally, meaning they are located outside the central nervous system. Now, if you remember, then this slide, we're going to focus on the key anatomical differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Let's talk about the sympathetic nervous system first. The sympathetic nervous system is a lot more complex system compared to the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, I'm going to draw a spinal cord the best I can. So that's a spinal cord, and this is a butterfly-shaped structure, okay, where you find the gray matter. And in some regions of the spinal cord, you find the lateral horns. The lateral horns. The lateral horns in the spinal cord is the region where you find cell bodies of the sympathetic nervous system, and you only see the lateral horns in between T1 to L2 vertebrae. You don't see these lateral horns in other regions of the spinal cord. If you remember this, you will remember where the sympathetic nerves originate in the spinal cord. So let's talk about the key anatomical features of the sympathetic nervous system. The first one is that they always originate only between T1 to L2 vertebrae, and this is the reason they are also called thoracolumbar nerves. The sympathetic nervous system contains two nerves pathway. So you have the preganglionic nerve and the postganglionic nerve. The preganglionic nerve is short. Why? Because the preganglionic nerve only needs to go to the ganglia that are present right by the vertebrae, so they don't need to travel a very long way. This makes sense that the preganglionic nerves are shorter in length. The postganglionic nerves are longer in length. Okay, so in the sympathetic nervous system, preganglionic nerves are short, postganglionic nerves are long. Okay. So in the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglia are close to the spinal cord, and these ganglia are located right outside the spinal cord, right outside the vertebrae. Okay, so these are called paravertebral ganglia. The paravertebral ganglia, para means close and vertebral means the vertebrae. They found right outside the spinal cord, and you need to understand that this picture is made a lot more simple than it actually is. Okay, the paravertebral ganglia are present on both sides of the spinal cord, and both sides run the same type of nerves to the target organ. Why? Because in event of, say, somebody pulling out right in front of you on the road while you're driving, you react immediately. Your heart heartbeat increases, you breathe faster, and your adrenal gland release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which evokes the fight or flight response. So during a sympathetic response, you need all hands on deck. You cannot take your sweet time to respond, right? And that's why you have the paravertebral ganglia on both sides of the spinal cord. The messages can be transmitted very quickly in a very short period of time, okay, to a whole bunch of different effectors like the heart, the lungs, the stomach, and then you become more alert, your pupil become dilated, right? And that's why we have two pairs, and both sides of the vertebrae have ganglia that run the nerves to the same type of organ system. And keep in mind, ganglia is a cluster of nerve cell bodies where two neurons interact with each other. Okay, so from the ganglia, there's another nerve that will carry the impulse to the target organ. So this chain of ganglia present alongside the vertebrae are known as sympathetic chain ganglia. Sympathetic chain ganglia. The parasympathetic nervous system is fairly simple compared to the sympathetic nervous system, and the ganglia are also fairly simple. So in a parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglions or the cell body cluster is found very far away from the spine. So then you don't see the paravertebral ganglia in the parasympathetic nervous system, okay? Because the cell bodies are located very close to the organ, like the heart, or you can find the ganglia inside the tissue itself. The other major key feature of parasympathetic nervous system is that the preganglionic nerve fibers are long. They are long because the impulse is being carried right from the brain or the spinal cord all the way to the organ itself, or very close to the organ. So the preganglionic axon fibers are very long. The postganglionic axon fibers are short. Okay, so let's look at another example. When you work out, your sympathetic nervous system constricts blood vessels, and it sends more blood to the skeletal muscle and heart muscle. At the same time, your bronchiole dilates, so we increase airflow, and simultaneously, the sympathetic nervous system also stimulates the liver to release more glucose into the bloodstream to meet the energy demand. So we make a lot of ATP while we are actively working out. Okay, so at the time you're working out, you need impulses to transmit really fast, really quickly to a whole bunch of different organs, to the blood vessels, to the heart, to the lungs, to the adrenal gland. And once you're done working out, in fact, simultaneously, the sympathetic nervous system is also counteracted by the parasympathetic nervous system to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so they have an opposing effect on each other. They don't inhibit each other, but they control each other's intensity. So when you're done working out, the parasympathetic division calms your body down, and the blood that was directed mostly towards your skeletal muscle is now directed back to your digestive system so you can digest the food. Okay, so from this slide, I hope you've understood the key differences in the anatomy of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Let's quickly revise the key differences. The parasympathetic nervous system originates from the cranium and the sacrum. So this nervous system is called the craniosacral division. And the sympathetic nervous system originates from the thoracic and the lumbar region. So it's called the lumbar region. The sympathetic nervous system contain long preganglionic fibers. Or did I say sympathetic? Sorry. The parasympathetic nervous system contains long preganglionic fibers. There is the sympathetic division contain short preganglionic fibers. The parasympathetic division contains short postganglionic fibers, whereas the sympathetic division contain long postganglionic fiber. Now, the ganglia or cell body clusters are located closer to the effector organ or within the tissue of the effector organ in the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, contains a sympathetic chain ganglia on both sides of the spinal cord located very close to the vertebrae, outside the vertebrae. Okay? These are the key anatomical differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system.